morning inside a small diner on the edge of a frozen city felt ordinary to notice the danger at first. No more shouting. No fights. Just laughter sharpened enough to cut a child who had nowhere to stand. An 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair lowered her eyes because she had learned early that silence was safer than asking adults to care. Then, without a sound, a German shepherd rose beside, a man who knew what it meant to stay when leaving was easier. The dog did not bark. He did not threaten. He simply placed himself between cruelty and someone who had been forgotten. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Winter in Duluth, Minnesota never felt like a season you could simply dress for. It behaved more like a force that negotiated nothing. Off Lake Superior, the wind cut through the city in long, steady drafts, slipping under door frames and into coat seams, turning every exposed inch of skin into a complaint. That morning, the sky was a dull, heavy gray, and the snow along the curb had been pressed into dirty ridges by tires and boots, refrozen into hard, uneven lines. Cars moved cautiously at intersections, wipers ticking across windshields with a tired rhythm. Breath turned to fog and disappeared before it fully formed. A few miles from the waterfront, along a highway that carried trucks toward the outskirts, sat a diner called Honey. The building was low and rectangular, brick darkened by years of salt and weather. Its windows were clouded with condensation, and the neon sign over the entrance flickered whenever the wind hit the frame, leaving the H2 blink like it was struggling to stay awake. Inside, the air smelled of coffee that had been brewed too early, fried eggs, and the lemon cleansing solution used after the overnight shift. The heat worked, but only in patches. The air was warm near the kitchen and cooler near the windows, where cold pressed through the glass. It was 6:47 a.m. The diner wasn't busy, but it wasn't empty either. Truckers stopping before a long haul, a couple of construction workers, a woman in a padded coat reading her phone, the kind of crowd that didn't look at each other unless there was a reason. Behind the counter, a small radio played softly, and the clink of mugs against saucers was frequent enough to become background noise. At a booth near the window sat Elias Eli Mercer, alone except for the dog under the table. Eli was 41, tall and broad-shouldered, with the compact, functional build of someone who had carried gear for years and never fully stopped training afterward. His face was angular, high cheekbones, a firm jaw, and a thin scar ran near his right eyebrow, faint but noticeable if you looked closely. His hair was cut short in a practical style, dark with a trace of gray at the temples. He wore a close-trimmed beard that outlined his jaw neatly, not because he cared about fashion, but because he disliked anything that felt sloppy. Even seated, his posture stayed straight, shoulders set as if his body still expected instructions. Eli's expression rarely changed much. His eyes did most of the work, muted hazel, steady, always tracking. He wasn't staring at anyone directly, but he was aware of the room the way some people were aware of the weather. Years earlier, while deployed, he had lost someone during an incident that looked harmless until it wasn't. No one had been loud. No one had panicked. The mistake had been assuming ordinary meant safe. That memory didn't make Eli aggressive. It made him careful. Since coming home, he avoided conflict when he could, but he didn't ignore it when it showed up. He had learned to keep his voice calm and his reactions controlled, because control was often the difference between solving a problem and creating a bigger one. In front of him sat a mug of black coffee, steam curling upward in thin threads. His right hand rested on a short leather leash looped around 2 fingers. Beneath the table, in the shadow of the booth, lay Zephyr. Zephyr was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a thick sable coat that caught warm highlights under the diner's overhead lights. He was large, athletic, and visibly well-trained. One ear had a small notch near the edge, a minor old injury that gave him a slightly hardened look. Without making him seem threatening, his eyes were dark and focused, and even while lying down, he didn't fully relax ears, angled to catch sound. Breathing, slow and controlled. He didn't fidget. He didn't seek attention. Zephyr carried himself like a working dog, which he was. He had been trained to stay close, to read shifts in tone and movement, and to hold position unless given a clear command. People who didn't understand dogs sometimes mistook that stillness for indifference. Ely knew better. It was discipline. Eli and Zephyr had been paired during a canine program and had worked together long enough to develop an easy, efficient trust. Eli didn't talk to Zephyr like a child, and Zephyr didn't behave like a pet. Their communication was subtle, small hand signals. Leash tension that barely changed. A look exchanged without drama. The dog followed Eli because Eli had earned it, and Eli relied on Zephyr because Zephyr had proven repeatedly that he could stay steady when everyone else got unpredictable. 2 booths away, near the aisle that led to the counter, sat Maisie Rowan in a wheelchair. She was 9, small for her age, bundled in a puffy winter coat that made her shoulders look narrower than they were. Her brown curls fell out from beneath a knit hat, framing a pale face flushed slightly from the cold. Faint freckles dusted her nose. A worn backpack hung off the back of her chair, and a small blue whale keychain swung from one zipper, tapping softly against the fabric whenever she shifted. Maisie's posture was careful, as if she had learned to take up as little space as possible. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, fingers lightly gripping the edge of her hat. Her eyes were large and dark, and she watched the door more than she watched her table. She wasn't restless, she was waiting. There was a difference. Waiting had become familiar to her, not because she liked it, but because she had needed it. Waiting through appointments. Waiting while adults talked over her. Waiting while people decided whether to be kind. Her mother, Dr. Tamsin Rohan, had stepped outside a few minutes earlier to take a call and check their car. Tamsin was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with a posture that suggested constant motion. Someone used to hospital hallways and schedules that didn't care if you were tired. Her hair was chestnut brown, usually tied back in a practical knot that loosened by the end of any long day. She worked in physical therapy, and it showed in the way she moved. Efficient, focused, always adjusting to what needed doing. She loved her daughter with the kind of intensity that didn't waste energy on speeches. When Maisie had first struggled with her condition, Tamsin had learned quickly that panic didn't help and anger didn't fix anything. What helped was attention, planning, and staying present. Even when she was exhausted, she had promised Maisie she'd be right back. Maisie had nodded. Because she always nodded, she was used to trusting adults and then managing the minutes until they returned. Behind the counter, Nolan Pike wiped down the same section of countertop twice, not because it needed it, but because repetition calmed him. Nolan was 35, with tired eyes and a narrow face that looked older than his age. His sandy blonde hair was thinning slightly at the temples, and his short beard was trimmed unevenly, the result of rushed mornings. Nolan didn't like confrontation. He ran Honeywell because it paid the bills, and because he had learned the hard way that one complaint could become a mess that lingered for months. The previous winter, a customer had slipped outside, and even though it hadn't been Nolan's fault, the aftermath had been paperwork, calls, and anxiety. Since then, Nolan tried to keep the diner quiet and predictable. He wasn't heartless, just cautious in a way that sometimes looked like avoidance. At the end of the counter sat Mabel Shortridge, a regular in her 60s, with silver hair cut into a bob and a bright scarf wrapped around her neck, as if color could argue with winter. She had been a music teacher for decades and still tapped rhythms with her fingers while she waited for refills. Mabel's humor was gentle and quick. She spoke Icily with the staff, knew most people by face, if not by name, and had the sharp, practiced awareness of someone who had spent years watching children as moods shift before the adults noticed. The bell over the diner door rang, and a gust of cold slid in. 4 teenagers entered together, shaking snow from their jackets. They were dressed well-expensive winter coats, clean shoes, backpacks that looked new. Their laughter came easily, loud enough to turn a few heads, but not loud enough to feel out of control. They carried themselves with the loose confidence of kids who expected the world to adjust around them. They scanned the room, chose a booth, and slid in right beside Maisie's table. The space suddenly felt tighter. At first, nothing happened, just conversation. Phones on the table, quick jokes shared between them. Then Eli noticed a change, small but clear. One of the boys glanced at Maisie's wheelchair and smirked before looking away. The girl with the phone leaned in and whispered something to her friend, and both of them laughed under their breath. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate. Maisie's shoulders drew in a fraction. Her gaze dropped to the tabletop, and her fingers tightened around her hat. She didn't turn toward them. She didn't ask them to stop. Her body language had the quiet economy of someone who had learned that reacting could make things worse. Under Eli's table, Zephyr's ears angled forward. His breathing remained slow, but his attention sharpened. He didn't move yet, but he was no longer resting. Eli felt it through the leash even without looking down. Eli kept his face neutral. He didn't reach for authority or make a show of watching. He simply noted where the teenagers were sitting, how close they were to Maisie, and the way the room's silence made space for whatever came next. Across from him, the window glass reflected Maisie's hunched posture, like an image you couldn't ignore once you saw it. The diner stayed quiet, clinging to routine the way people did when they didn't want trouble. But the ordinary had already shifted, and both Eli and Zephyr knew it. The diner kept trying to stay ordinary. That was the strangest part. How the room clung to routine, as if routine could hold it together. Cups still clinked. The radio still murmured. The griddle still hissed. Yet the air around Maisie's booth tightened, almost imperceptibly, like a belt cinched one notch at a time. The 4 teenagers didn't need to raise their voices to take up space. Their confidence did that for them. The tall boy sat half-turned in his seat, one arm draped over the back, posture loose, as if the booth belonged to him. His hair was cut in a clean fade and styled forward with too much product, the kind of effort meant to look effortless. He had a smooth face, no acne, no beard, no signs life had ever demanded much from him. His eyes, pale and quick, moved through the diner like he was browsing a menu of people. The shorter boy beside him was wiry and restless, fingers tapping the edge of his phone, knee bouncing. He kept glancing at Maisie as if curiosity and cruelty were the same impulse. Across from them, the girl with the phone-long dark hair, lashes heavy, nails immaculate, held her screen low and angled, filming nothing in particular but ready to make something of anything. The other girl, fair-haired and sharp-featured, watched the room with a practiced smirk that looked rehearsed in a mirror. Maisie stayed still. She stared at the tabletop, tracing faint scratches with her eyes. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but the grip on her hat tightened until her knuckles paled. She could feel them beside her like heat, like noise, even when they weren't speaking to her. She knew this pattern, the look first, then the joke tossed out to the group, then the laugh that made sure she heard it. She didn't look up, because looking up was an invitation. Eli kept his face neutral, but his attention narrowed. He didn't stare directly at them, not in a way that would escalate things. Yet he tracked the micro-move, the way that tall boy's shoulders rolled back when he sensed no one was challenging him, the way the shorter boy leaned too close, as if testing the boundary of Maisie's space, the way the phone girl's camera lens glinted for a second as she lifted it and lowered it again. Eli's hand remained on Zephyr's leash, loose enough to signal calm, firm enough to signal readiness. Zephyr stayed down, but his ears stayed forward. His eyes moved in short, controlled shifts. He was reading them the way he'd been trained to read a room breath. Tone, posture. Eli had learned to trust that reading. He'd also learned not to move too soon. If you stepped in too early, bullies often sharpened. If you stepped in too late, someone got hurt. The first comment came out like a casual remark, aimed at no one, meant for everyone. Must be nice, the tall boy said, loud enough to carry 2 tables over. You never have to walk anywhere. People just push you around. The others laughed, not surprised. Not even especially amused, just pleased to have initiated the ritual. The shorter boy added, yeah, VIP seating everywhere. Maisie's shoulders drew in. Her chin dipped. She focused on the edge of her hot chocolate, the small ring of foam along the rim. Her breath shortened. She didn't cry. She had learned not to. Tears made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made adults leave faster. At the counter, Mabel's tapping stopped. She turned her head slightly, not openly, but enough to catch the line of Maisie's posture. Mabel's eyes narrowed, the way a teacher's eyes narrowed when she heard a kid say something funny that wasn't funny at all. She didn't speak yet. Experience told her timing mattered. Sometimes you had to wait until the room was forced to pay attention. Nolan Pike, behind the counter, heard it too. He froze for half a second, then resumed wiping, shoulders tense. His eyes flicked toward the teenagers, then away. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself it would pass. Nolan's caution had its own logic. If he confronted them and they complained, if they called their parents, if the parents left a review, the diner took the hit. He hated that this was how his mind worked, but it was. Fear didn't always look like cowardice. Sometimes it looked like a man cleaning the same spot until it shone. The teenagers kept going, warmed by silence. The phone girl lifted her screen just enough to frame her friends. Not Maisie directly, but close. She whispered, "Don't," as if warning them, while smiling like she wanted them to anyway. The fair-haired girl leaned toward Maisie's chair, just slightly, eyes traveling over the wheels and footrests, as if inspecting an object. "That's kind of convenient," she said, like built-in transportation. "Wish I had one for the mall." The laugh that followed was quieter, sharper. It wasn't the kind that filled the room. It was the kind meant to slice a single person. Eli inhaled slowly through his nose. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He'd seen what happened when adults stormed in with righteous anger. Bullies turned into victims in 10 seconds flat. He needed to stay controlled. He needed facts if this turned into a scene. Then the tall boy shifted in his seat and stretched his legs out, casually, as if he owned the floor space. The toe of his clean boot brushed the rim of Maisie's wheel. It could have been accidental. That was the point. The boot tapped again, lighter, testing. Maisie flinched, small and quick, and then forced herself to go still again, as if movement would only attract more attention. Zephyr rose from his down position into a seated posture so quietly it barely registered. Eli felt the change through the leash. No tug, no strain, just Zephyr's readiness. The dog's head lifted above the booth line, ears forward, eyes steady. His mouth remained closed. No crawl, no bark, just presence. The teenagers noticed. The phone girl's smile faltered for the first time. The shorter boy leaned back instinctively. The tall boy's gaze lifted toward Zephyr with a mix of interest and irritation, like someone discovering the room had rules after all. "Is that dog trained?" the fair-haired girl asked, uncertainty slipping into her voice. "Probably just some guy's pet," the tall boy said, dismissive. Then, as if to prove he wasn't impressed, he looked straight at Eli and grinned. "Your dog got a problem." Eli met his eyes without expression. "Leave her alone," he said, calm and low. The tall boy's grin widened, but it wasn't friendly. "We are leaving her alone," he replied. "We're just talking." Free country. Mabel shifted on her stool, lips parting as if she might speak. Nolan's eyes snapped up again, caught between annoyance and fear. A few other customers glanced over, then looked away quickly, as if the situation might infect them if they watched too long. Maisie's hands clenched. She felt the room's attention moving around her like wine touching her, not helping her. She hated that the spotlight always arrived at the worst moment. The shorter boy, encouraged by the tall one, leaned forward and reached down as if to pick something up. His fingers brushed the side of Maisie's wheelchair near the brake lever. It was subtle, quick, barely a touch, but Eli saw it. He'd spent years watching hands. Hands were honest even when mouths lied. Eli's voice stayed even. "Don't touch her chair." The shorter boy pulled back, palms up in mock innocence. "Relax." I dropped my napkin. The tall boy laughed. "Man, you're sensitive." Zephyr shifted from sitting to standing in one smooth motion. He stepped forward only one step, placing his body between the teenagers, Booth and Maisie's chair. He didn't lunge. His tail remained low and still. His head stayed level. It was not an attack. It was a boundary. The effect was immediate. The laughter died. The phone girl lowered her screen. The fair-haired girl stiffened, eyes flicking toward the counter, like she wanted an adult to fix it. The tall boy's posture changed, two shoulders squaring, chin lifting, the instinctive response of someone whose dominance had been challenged. Nolan finally moved. He set down the towel and stepped out from behind the counter, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he called, voice too cheerful. "Everything okay over there?" The tall boy jumped on the opening. "Your customer's dog is threatening us," he said loudly, raising his voice now because volume felt like power. He shouldn't have that thing in here. It was a clean pivot, practiced. Eli recognized it immediately. The bully's favorite trick, then claim danger when the line is drawn. Nolan's gaze fixed on Zephyr, then darted to Eli's leash hand. "Sir," Nolan said, trying to keep his tone polite, "I need your dog to stay under the table. Customers are getting nervous." Eli didn't argue. He gave Zephyr a small hand signal. Palm down, and Zephyr froze in place, standing but still, eyes steady. Eli's calm didn't soften the room. It sharpened it. Calm in conflict made people choose sides. Mabel spoke before anyone else could. Her voice was clear, but not loud. The voice of a teacher addressing a classroom without needing to shout. "That dog hasn't threatened anyone," she said, looking at Nolan first, then at the teenagers. "He stood up because you started picking at that little girl." The tall boy scoffed. "We didn't do anything." Mabel's expression didn't change. "Sometimes anything is exactly the problem," she replied. A man near the window knew to Eli. Awareness set down his fork and turned slightly. He was in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with weathered skin and a short beard flecked with gray. He wore a heavy work jacket stained faintly with grease, hands rough like he used them for honest labor. His name, Eli would learn later, was Graham Holt, a dock mechanic who had spent years on the lakefront. Graham's gaze was steady, and he spoke like a man who didn't waste words. "I saw the boot hit the wheel," he said. "Twice." The tall boy's face flushed, anger and embarrassment fighting for control. "Whatever," he muttered. But his confidence had been nicked. Nolan swallowed, eyes flicking between the witnesses and the teenagers. He wasn't ready to be brave. He was ready to manage. "Okay," he said, voice tight. "Let's all calm down." Eli looked at Maisie. She hadn't moved, but her breathing was shallow and fast. Her eyes were fixed on the table, and her fingers had gone white around her hat. Zephyr stood between her and the teenagers like a living wall. Eli made a decision. He stood slowly, careful not to move suddenly. The booth seat creaked. Attention pulled toward him like a magnet. He kept one hand on the leash, the other relaxed at his side. His voice stayed low enough that people had to listen to hear it. "My dog isn't here to scare anyone," he said. "He's here with me." But he won't watch someone get harassed and do nothing. Nolan's mouth tightened. I understand, he said, though his eyes said he didn't. But I'm going to need you to step outside with him for a moment, just until we cool this off. Eli nodded once. He could feel Maisie's fear spike even before she spoke. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders pulled inward as if she were bracing for impact. He gave Zephyr the hand signal to heel and began to turn, not yet leaving, but showing Nolan he was complying. Zephyr obeyed instantly, stepping back half a pace, ready to follow. That was when Maisie finally found her voice. It came out thin, barely more than breath. Please, Eli, stopped. Maisie swallowed, eyes still down, as if looking up might shatter her courage. When you go, she whispered, they start again. The sentence landed hard. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was a fact learned through repetition. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before. This wasn't the quiet of avoidance. It was the quiet of recognition. Eli turned back toward her, his expression still controlled but softer at the edge. Zephyr, beside him, stood perfectly still, ears forward, waiting. Nolan's face changed too. His caution didn't disappear, but it shifted under the weight of a child's honesty. Mabel's eyes closed for a brief second, as if she was tired of how predictable cruelty could be. Graham Holt's jaw tightened. Outside, unseen through the fogged window, a car engine coughed, then tried again. Somewhere in the cold, Tamsin was still fighting with the morning. Inside Honeyrail, the ornery had finally broken, and everyone in the room knew the next choice who would stay silent, who would speak, and who would stand would matter. The quiet that followed Maisie's words did not feel fragile. It felt heavy, like something finally placed on the table where no one could pretend not to see it. The diner seemed to shrink around that single sentence we knew go. They start again as if the walls themselves leaned in to hear whether the adults in the room would accept it as truth or dismiss it as inconvenience. Eli did not move immediately. He stayed where he was, half turned toward the door, Zephyr poised at his side. His expression remained controlled, but the stillness in him had changed. This was no longer a question of manners or policy. It was about whether leaving would mean abandoning a child who had already learned what abandonment looked like. Maisie kept her eyes down, breath shallow. Speaking had taken more from her than she wanted anyone to know. She had not accused. She had not begged. She had stated a pattern, one built from experience. The fact that she had learned it at all sat uneasily in the room. Nolan Pike cleared his throat. Up close. The tension in him showed in small ways, the way his shoulders crept upward, the way his fingers kept rubbing the towel, even though the counter was already clean. He looked at Maisie, then at the teenagers, then at Eli and the dog. Nolan was not a cruel man, but he was a man trained by consequences. Every choice he made ran through a private calculation. What happens after this? Who complains? Who pays? I just need to keep things from escalating, Nolan said, voice tight but measured. He spoke to Eli, not to Maisie. Sir, if you step outside with your dog, it'll calm everyone down. The tall boy seized on the word everyone. Exactly, he said, louder. Now, we're uncomfortable. That dog stood up like it was going to attack us. That dog stood up because you wouldn't back off? Graham Holt replied from the window table. Graham had risen halfway from his seat, his large frame casting a long shadow across the floor. He wasn't angry, but there was a bluntness to him that came from years of working around heavy machinery and people who lied badly. You don't get to poke at a kid and then act surprised when someone notices. The phone girl rolled her eyes, but she lowered her screen completely this time. The fair-haired girl crossed her arms, chin lifting defensively. The shorter boy avoided eye contact altogether, staring hard at the tabletop as if it might open and swallow him. Zephyr remained still. His stance had not changed, weight evenly distributed. Head level, eyes alert, There was nothing threatening about him, unless you were looking for a reason to feel threatened. Eli's leash hand stayed relaxed. He did not correct Zephyr because there was nothing to correct. Maisie's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the adults talking around her, about her, and she hated how familiar that felt. She had expected, after speaking, to feel relief. Instead, she felt exposed, as if she had stepped into cold air without her coat. Her fingers loosened from the hat only because they had gone numb. Mabel Shortridge pushed back from the counter and stood fully now. She was shorter than most people in the room, her shoulders rounded with age, but there was nothing small about the way she spoke. "Nolan," she said, using his name the way teachers used names when they needed to be heard. "You're asking the wrong person to leave." Nolan winced slightly. "Mabel, no," she cut in gently. "Listen, I taught kids for 30 years. I know the sound of just joking. And I know the sound of a child who's learned to be quiet, so grown-ups don't get uncomfortable." She gestured toward Maisie without touching her. "That dog hasn't raised his voice. He hasn't moved toward anyone. The only thing that changed in this room is that someone finally said out loud what's been happening." A murmur rippled through the diner. Not loud agreement, but something closer to acknowledgement. A woman near the register nodded without realizing she was doing it. One of the construction workers shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Nolan's eyes flicked toward the corner of the ceiling, where a small security camera blinked red. The thought had been hovering in his mind since the first raised voice. He hadn't wanted to go, that it meant paperwork. It meant decisions, but the camera had been installed for a reason. He looked back at the teenagers. "If you didn't do anything," he said slowly, "then the footage will show that." The tall boy stiffened. "That's ridiculous," he said. "We didn't touch her." Graham didn't hesitate. "You touched the chair," he sighed flatly. "That's touching her." Eli finally turned fully back toward the room. He knelt slightly, not all the way down, just enough to bring himself closer to Maisie's eye level without crowding her. He kept his voice low. "I'm not leaving you alone," he said simply. "My dog stays right here. He'll sit. He won't move." He stood again and looked at Nolan. "Step outside, if you insist," he continued, even respectful. "But my dog stays seated between them and her until her mom comes back." "That's it." Nolan hesitated. He had expected resistance, anger, arguments, maybe even threats. What he got instead was calm certainty, which was harder to push against. He looked at Zephyr again. The dog's posture was textbook perfect, the kind Nolan had seen in police demonstrations at county fairs. Controlled, predictable. The teenagers waited, tension sharp on their faces. The tall boy's confidence had thinned, replaced by irritation. He was used to adults folding faster than this. "Fine," Nolan said finally. "Dog stays sitting. No movement. And you," he added, pointing at the teenagers, "knock it off. All of it." Zephyr responded to Eli's signal immediately, lowering himself into a sit. His tail rested still against the floor. His eyes never left the space in front of Maisie's chair. Maisie released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not fully, but enough to feel the difference. She still didn't look up, but the tightness in her chest eased a fraction. The tall boy scoffed, though it lacked conviction now. "This is stupid." "It's done," Nolan said, voice firmer than before. Something in him had shifted to, he didn't like the way this felt, but he liked even less the idea of being the man who asked a child to endure it quietly. The diner did not return to normal. Not yet. Conversations resumed in fits and starts. Coffee was poured. Plates were cleared. But attention lingered, stretched thin between Maisie's table and the booth beside it. A few minutes passed like that, tense, watchful. Then the door opened again, letting in another gust of cold. This time, it was Tamsin Rohan. She stepped inside briskly, phone tucked into her coat pocket. cheeks flushed from the wind. She was tall and lean, her posture alert even in motion. Strands of chestnut hair had slipped loose around her face, and her eyes scanned the room instantly, not for friends, but for problems. Years in rehabilitation wards had trained her to read but the way others read faces. She saw Maisie first. She saw the way her daughter sat unusually rigid, hands clenched in her lap. She saw the dog seated beside her, large and unmistakable. She saw the teenagers frozen in a posture that suggested they'd been challenged. The picture assembled itself quickly. "What's going on?" Tamsin asked, voice calm but edged with steel. Maisie turned her head then, relief breaking through her control. "Mom," she said, the word carrying more weight than the syllables alone. Nolan stepped forward, already rehearsing his explanation. Eli stayed where he was, giving Tamsin space to reach her daughter. Zephyr remained seated, unblinking. There were some comments. No one began. "We're handling it." Tamsin didn't answer him immediately. She crouched beside Maisie, hands gentle but sure as she checked her posture. Her breathing, the position of the chair. "Are you hurt?" she asked quietly. Maisie shook her head. "No, just scared." Tamsin straightened slowly when she faced the teenagers. Her expression was controlled, professional, but unmistakably protective. "Did you say something to my child?" she asked. The tall boy opened his mouth, then closed it. The shorter boy stared at the floor. The phone girl looked away. Graham Holt spoke before anyone else could. "They were running their mouths," he said, and touching her chair. Tamsin's jaw tightened. She turned to Nolan. "You have cameras?" Nolan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's look," Tamsin said. No one argued. As Nolan headed toward the back office, the room shifted again. This wasn't confrontation anymore. This was evidence. The teenager's bravado drained, replaced by the dull awareness that pretending wouldn't work this time. Zephyr remained seated, a quiet constant amid the movement. Ely watched Tamsin guide Maisie closer to her, shielding her without smothering her. He recognized that balance. It was the same one he tried to keep with Zephyr Protect without taking away agency. The monitor flickered on in the back room. Grainy footage played, the glances, the leaning bodies, the boot tapping the wheel, the hand near the brake, the dog stepping forward and stopping. The truth did not need commentary. When Nolan returned to the dining floor, his face had changed. The hesitation was gone. "You need to leave," he told the teenagers. "Now." The tall boy started to protest, then stopped. There was nowhere left to push. Chairs scraped as they stood, movements sharp with embarrassment. They gathered their things and filed out without another word. The door closed behind them, the bell ringing once. The diner exhaled. Maisie leaned into her mother, finally allowing herself to relax. Zephyr stayed seated until Eli signaled otherwise. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of ending, but something had been set right, at least for the moment, and the morning, altered though it was, moved forward. When the door of Honeyrail closed behind the teenagers, the sound of the bell lingered longer than it should have. Not because it was loud, but because it marked the end of something fragile. Moment when cruelty had been visible, undeniable, and then forced to leave. What followed was not relief, exactly. It was something quieter and more complicated, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it too long. The diner did not erupt into conversation. People returned to their meals slowly, cautiously, as if sudden movement might undo what had just been set right. The radio continued its low murmur, and the griddle hissed as another order went down. But the atmosphere had changed. Ordinary sounds felt sharper now, more intentional. Tamsin Rowan remained beside her daughter, one hand resting lightly on the arm of Maisie's wheelchair. Up close, the lines of fatigue around her eyes were more visible, but so was the steadiness beneath them. She had the calm presence of someone accustomed to managing crises without dramatizing them. Her coat was still on, unzipped, one glove tucked into a pocket. She did not rush to sit. She stayed where she was, grounding Maisie before doing anything else. Maisie leaned in to her mother's side, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. She did not cry. Instead, she breathed deeply, deliberately, like someone relearning how safe air felt. Her gaze lifted briefly and landed on Zephyr. The dog sat exactly where he had been told, postured, impeccable eyes, soft but alert. The faint notch in his ear caught the light as he turned his head just slightly, acknowledging her without staring. He stayed, Maisie said quietly, almost to herself. Tamsin followed her gaze. She studied Zephyr with professional interest at first, the way she studied posture, balanced then with something warmer. Yes, she replied. Hey there. Eli stood a few steps back, giving them space. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation ebbed now, leaving behind a familiar heaviness. He felt it settle in his shoulders, in the back of his neck. This was the part he never liked, the aftermath. When everyone decided what the moment had meant, Nolan Pike hovered nearby, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. The decision he had made still sat uneasily in his chest. He knew it was the right one. He also knew it might cost him later. Experience had taught him that doing the right thing did not always come with immediate reassurance. Still, he straightened his posture and cleared his throat. I'm sorry, he said to Tamsin, voice low. That shouldn't have happened. Not here. Tamsin looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded once. Thank you for stopping it, she said. She did not soften the statement with praise, nor did she sharpen it with blame. She treated it as what it was, an acknowledgement of responsibility. Nolan exhaled, a breath he had done. The realist he'd been holding. Coffee's on the house, he added, almost Tamsin managed a small smile. She'll take hot chocolate, she said, glancing down at Maisie. Mabel Shortridge returned to her stool at the counter, but turned sideways so she could still see Maisie. Her scarf had slipped loose, and she adjusted it absently. You did good, kid, she said to Maisie, her tone gentle and metallic. It's not easy to say what you said. Maisie looked unsure how to respond to that kind of attention. She nodded, then looked back at her hands. Compliments, like confrontations, took energy. Graham Holt settled back into his seat, picking up his fork again. The confrontation had stirred something old in him. Years earlier, he'd watched a coworker get run out of a job by sharper cruelty, the kind no one wanted to acknowledge because it was inconvenient. Graham had stayed silent then. He didn't plan to do that again. Zephyr finally received a release signal from Eli. The dog shifted from his rigid sit into a more relaxed posture, lowering himself to the floor with controlled grace. His tail rested against the tile. Still, his breathing steady, the work was done, but he remained attentive, the way he always did. Tamsin turned toward Eli for the first time since the teenagers had left. Up close, she noticed the careful restraint in him, the way he stood without imposing, the way his eyes stayed alert even now. She had seen men like him before. Not aggressive, not passive, but measured. Thank you, she said. Both of you. Eli shook his head slightly. He didn't do anything, he replied, nodding toward Zephyr. He just stayed where he needed to. Tamsin's lips curved faintly. Sometimes that's everything, she said. Maisie glanced up at Eli then, curiosity overtaking fear. Is he always that quiet? She asked. Eli considered the question. Only when it matters, he said. That earned him a small, genuine smile from Maisie. It was brief, but it was unguarded, and Eli felt it land heavier than any praise ever had. A few minutes passed. The diner continued to normalize, though the normalization felt earned now rather than forced. Nolan rang up checks. The waitress refilled mugs. Outside, the wind rattled the windows again, reminding everyone that the world beyond Honeyrail had not softened just because they had. Then, Nolan did something unexpected. He disappeared briefly into the back office and returned, holding a small laminated sign. It was simple black text on a white background. He hesitated, then taped it to the inside of the front door at eye level. Please treat everyone with respect. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't clever. It was clear. Mabel noticed first and nodded to herself. About time, she murmured. Tamsin gathered her coat and gloves, preparing to leave. The morning had already taken more time than she'd planned, but she felt oddly lighter. She adjusted Maisie's backpack and smoothed her daughter's hair. Ready? She asked. Maisie hesitated, then looked at Zephyr again. Can I say goodbye? She asked softly. Eli nodded. Go ahead. Maisie reached out, careful and slow, and rested her hand against Zephyr's shoulder. His fur was warm beneath her palm, solid and reassuring. Zephyr did not move, but he angled his head slightly, acknowledging the touch. For Maisie, the moment anchored itself somewhere, deep a memory of safety that would not easily fade. Bye, she whispered. Tamsin guided her toward the door. Before stepping out, she turned back to Eli. You didn't have to get involved, she said. A lot of people wouldn't have. Eli met her gaze. I know, he replied. Outside, the cold reclaimed them quickly. Tamsin pulled Maisie's hat down over her ears, her movements efficient but gentle. As they moved toward their car, Maisie glanced back to the diner window once. She saw Eli standing by his booth, Zephyr at his feet, the laminated sign on the door. The image settled into her mind like something to return to later. Inside, Eli paid his check. Nolan waved off part of it, insisting. And this time, Eli didn't argue. He clipped Zephyr's leash and stood, pulling on his coat. The morning light had shifted slightly, brighter now, though the sky remained gray. As Eli and Zephyr stepped toward the exit, Mabel called out, Hey, Eli turned. You did the right thing, she said, not smiling. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Eli inclined his head. He didn't trust himself to answer. Outside, the wind cut sharp again, but it didn't feel as hostile as before. Zephyr walked at Eli's side, head level, gait steady. They reached the car, and Eli paused for a moment before opening the door. Looking back at Honeyrail, the neon sign flickered once, then held. The morning had not changed the world. It had not erased cruelty or rewritten the rules of it, but something had shifted small, precise, and real. A line had been drawn, not with force, but with presence. Eli opened the door. Zephyr jumped in easily, curling into his usual spot as Eli slid into the driver's seat. He felt the quiet settle around him, again not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet that comes after a choice has been made. They pulled out of the lot, the diner receding in the rearview mirror, still standing against the wind. And that was enough. The highway north of Duluth unwound in long, disciplined stretches, bordered by bare trees and frozen shoulders of snow that caught the light like dull glass. Eli Mercer drove with both hands on the wheel, posture easy but alert, the way habit never fully loosens its grip. Zephyr slept in the back seat, curled into a practiced crescent, rising and falling with a steady breath that matched the road's rhythm. The wind off Lake Superior still pressed hard against the car, but inside there was a quieter weather one that followed a decision already made. Eli didn't replay the diner in his mind the way people expected him to. He didn't savor the confrontation or the way it ended. What lingered instead was Maisie's voice, factual, too practiced for a cha. Then the room had changed when truth finally entered it. He had learned long ago that moments like that didn't announce themselves as heroic. They arrived as questions. Will you stay? And once answered, they moved on without ceremony. By mid-morning, the wind sharpened again, and Eli pulled into a small rest stop overlooking the lake. The water was a flat slate color, ice forming along the edges like the beginning of a boundary. He led Zephyr out to stretch. The dog shook once, ears pricking, then stood beside Eli, facing the open expanse. Zephyr was, aging 7, wasn't old for a German shepherd, but it was old enough for experience to show in the way he conserved motion. His coat had thickened over the years, darker along the spine, lighter near the shoulders. He moved with a confidence that came from repetition, not bravado. Eli leaned against the car and watched the lake. He thought of the sign Nolan had taped to the door. Please treat everyone with respect. Simple words. Imperfect shield. Still, shields mattered. His phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. Eli answered without preamble. Mercer, this is Colonel Arthur Halley. The voice said unhurried, carrying the weight of authority without leaning on it. Halley was in his early 50s, though Eli wouldn't see him until later. Tall, spare, with a face weathered by command decisions and early mornings. Halley had spent a career coordinating between uniformed services and civilian agencies across the region. Years ago, a failed de-escalation had cost him a young officer. Since then, he had become exacting about restraint. I'm calling about a report from Honeywell this morning, Halley continued. And a video? Eli closed his eyes briefly. Not in dread, but in recognition. Systems worked when they wanted to. Yes, sir. I watched it twice, Halley said. Your dog's posture. Your timing. The absence of escalation. That matters. He paused, letting the sentence settle. We're building a small community in its presence over enforcement. I'd like to talk. Eli looked out at the lake again, the wind skimming its surface. I'm on leave, he said. Hale's reply came easily. So am I, in a way. We can talk when you're ready. The call ended without pressure. Eli stood there a moment longer, then clipped Zephyr's leash and headed back to the car. Responsibility had a way of finding him when he wasn't looking for it. That afternoon, back in Duluth, Tamsin, Rohan kept her promise to normalcy. She made soup, helped Maisie with homework, and pretended only a little that the morning had been routine. Maisie worked quietly at the kitchen table, her wheelchair angled just enough to see the window. Outside, snow dusted the sill. She paused mid-problem and asked, Mom, yes, honey. The dog didn't bark, Maisie said, as if testing the memory. He just stayed. Tamsin smiled, soft and tired. That's a good kind of strong. 2 days later, Nolan Pike watched the diner's security footage again before filing it. He hadn't planned to keep a record beyond the minimum, but something about the clip bothered him in a productive way. He attached a brief note handled without force. Witnesses corroborated, child protected. He sent it up the chain because, for once, he wanted the record to reflect what he'd seen. The sign stayed on the door. The meeting Halley proposed took place a week later in a modest community center south of town. The building smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Folding chairs ringed a whiteboard still marked with a youth basketball schedule. No flags, no cameras. Halley arrived early, coat folded over his arm. He had silvered hair, kept short, a close beard, trimmed with care, and eyes that listened more than they judged. Eli entered with Zephyr at heel. The dog's nails clicked softly on the tile before settling. Halley observed Zephyr the way one professional observes another, without sentiment, with respect. They talked for an hour. Not about heroism, about thresholds, about how often adults mistook neutrality for safety, about dogs trained to read stress and handlers trained to wait. Halley admitted his own failure years. Earlier the day, he'd ordered a withdrawal too soon. Stepping back isn't always restraint, he said quietly. Sometimes it's abandonment. Eli nodded. He had lived that sentence. They agreed to start small. A pilot-safe ground workshops at schools and community centers. No enforcement. No lectures. Presence. Demonstration. Conversation. Zephyr would be there to show what control looked like without teeth. On Eli's last morning in Duluth, he returned to honey, not out of habit, out of closure. The neon hummed. The air smelled like coffee and toast. Mabel waved from the counter. Nolan poured a mug without asking. Maisie arrived with her mother just after 7. Tamsin looked steadier, not rested, but grounded. Maisie spotted Eli and smiled, small and open. Zephyr's tail tapped once against the floor before stilling. "Morning," Eli said. "Morning," Maisie replied. They didn't need more words. That was the gift. When Eli stood to leave, Maisie straightened. "He's quiet," she said, nodding at Zephyr. Eli smiled faintly. "That's his job." Outside, the cold bit cleanly. Tamsin shook Eli's hand. "They're lucky to have you," she said. Eli shook his head. "We're lucky when we listen." He left town before noon. The highway stretched ahead, white and gray. Zephyr slept most of the drive, waking only when they stopped. Posture alert until motion returned. Life resumed its patterns. In the weeks that followed, safe ground began without fanfare. A handful of rooms, a handful of kids. Zephyr sat. Eli spoke when asked. Nolan kept the sign up. Mabel taught music on Thursdays. Graham Holt volunteered rides when he could. Maisie spoke a little louder in class, not much, just enough. When someone looked too long, she held their gaze. No plaques were mounted. No articles ran. The line drawn that morning did not need witnesses to hold. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come quietly, through ordinary people who choose not to look away. They arrive when someone stays, when a dog sits, when a room decides that silence will no longer protect the wrong thing, and that line drawn without force held. Sometimes we imagine miracles arriving with thunder voices from the sky, light breaking through clouds, moments so loud they cannot be ignored. But more often, God works in quieter ways. He works through a person who chooses to stay when it would be easier to walk away, through a steady heart that refuses to look the other direction, through a silent dog who stands guard without teeth or anger, only presence. That morning in a diner did not change the whole world. It did something smaller and far more lasting. It reminded one child that she was not invisible. It reminded a room full of strangers that silence can either protect cruelty or stop it. And it reminded us that God's hands often look like human hands, acting with courage, restraint, and compassion. In our daily lives, we may never face a moment that feels this dramatic, but every day we are given choices just as meaningful. To speak when silence would harm, to stay when leaving feels safer, to protect dignity when no one else is watching. Those choices are where faith becomes real. If this story moved your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this message stirred in you. And if you believe that quiet, strength, kindness, and God's miracles still have a place in this world, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in your daily walk. And may He'll remind you that even the